Picture this: the year is 1216, and the most powerful man in England lies helpless in a castle chamber that reeks of sickness and despair. King John, the same ruler who once ordered nobles hanged from battlements and starved women and children in dungeons, is now reduced to writhing in his own filth. His golden crown sits abandoned on a wooden table, forgotten, while his courtiers retreat to the far corners of the room, covering their noses with silk cloths to block the stench. The storm outside lashes against the stone walls of Newark Castle, but the greater storm rages within his own body. This is not the glorious death of a warrior king on the battlefield, nor the serene passing of a monarch surrounded by prayers and dignity. This is humiliation in its purest form. His intestines revolt, his strength drains away, and each spasm is a reminder that no crown, no army, no treasure can save him from the rebellion of his own flesh. For years, he had ruled with cruelty and greed, crushing opposition with iron fists. But now, as fever consumes him and his bowels betray him, his enemies celebrate, convinced that England itself will collapse with his final breath. What they do not yet realize is that out of this grotesque deathbed would rise a 9-year-old boy, Henry III, and a legacy far greater than John ever intended. But to understand how a hated king's disgrace could shape the future of a nation, we must return to the days just before his fall, when greed, paranoia, and a fateful journey through the marshes sealed his doom. The chamber of Newark Castle was heavy with silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of a dying king. Outside, rain lashed against the narrow windows, and thunder rolled over the Trent Valley like the growl of an unseen beast. But inside, the real storm raged within the body of John, King of England, a monarch whose cruelty had made him hated by his people, feared by his enemies, and despised even by many who had once sworn loyalty to him. It was October of 1216, and the kingdom stood on the edge of collapse. French soldiers under Prince Louis marched through the countryside, welcomed by rebel barons who had long ago lost faith in their king. London itself was already hailing a foreign prince as rightful ruler. Yet here, in this chamber, the man who had sparked it all, who had clawed his way to absolute authority, lay powerless. His body, once nourished on the finest foods of Christendom, betrayed him with each violent spasm of his bowels. The stench filled the room, so strong that his attendants, nobles, and physicians covered their faces with perfumed cloths. Some whispered prayers, others simply wished the ordeal would end, unable to look at the man they served. John had demanded obedience, even love, from those around him for nearly 2 decades. Now he inspired only pity, or worse, disgust. The irony was cruel. This was the same king who had starved women and children to death in castles, who had ordered entire towns set ablaze for defying him, who had murdered his own nephew with his bare hands. Yet now, he died as a common soldier might after drinking tainted water on campaign, racked by dysentery, dehydrated, trembling with fever. To his enemies, it seemed divine justice. To his courtiers, it was simply unbearable. Every detail of the room spoke of decline. His crown, once the symbol of Plantagenet might, sat abandoned on a wooden table, jewels catching the flicker of candlelight. The sheets of the bed were stained with sweat and worse, and no amount of herbs or incense could mask the foul air. Master Peter, his physician, hovered helplessly at a safe distance. He had tried every remedy known to medieval medicine, bloodletting, which only weakened the king further, bitter tinctures that worsened the cramps, talismans and prayers that brought no relief. The man who had commanded thousands in battle could not command his own body to stop rebelling. In lucid moments between the spasms, John attempted to play the role of king. Letters were dictated to scribes who tried not to gag as they bent close enough to hear him. Orders were given to commanders who stood stiff and formal, though their eyes betrayed doubt that their master would live to see another day. Even in these moments, John's voice lacked conviction. It was weak, hoarse, and trembling. Authority, once enforced with fear and cruelty, had been stripped away by sickness. And yet, in these final days, memories flooded back with cruel clarity. He remembered his coronation at Westminster in 1199, when he had placed the crown upon his head as if daring the world to defy him. He remembered the rebellion of the barons, forcing him to sign the Magna Carta at sword point in 1215. He remembered the sweet taste of vengeance when Pope Innocent III declared the charter null and void, freeing him, at least for a time, from its humiliating restrictions. And he remembered, above all, the disaster that had sealed his fate just days before, the drowning of his treasure in the treacherous waters of the Wash. That single catastrophe had broken him. The loss of jewels, gold, and regalia was more than a financial disaster, it was the shattering of his legitimacy. Without treasure, he could not pay his mercenaries. Without regalia, he could not symbolize authority. Without wealth, he was reduced to little more than another warlord in a land already torn apart by rival claims. The shock of that day, when wagons loaded with centuries of plunder disappeared beneath rising waters, had struck him like a blow to the chest. Chroniclers would later write that grief alone had triggered his illness, as if the soul of a tyrant had collapsed under the weight of his own greed. Now, lying in Newark, he relived it in fevered fragments, the shouts of men as the tide rushed in, the horses screaming as they sank, the glint of golden chalices disappearing beneath grey water. He had lost everything in the mud, the crown of his grandmother, Empress Matilda, swords blessed by archbishops, jeweled rings that testified to divine right. All gone. And with them, his future. It was no wonder, then, that his body had begun to unravel. Stress, shock, and disease combined to strip him of dignity in the most humiliating way possible. For a king who had prided himself on control, of nobles, of armies, of entire realms, the lack of control over his own flesh was a punishment worse than rebellion. Word spread quickly through England. "The king is dying," people whispered in markets and taverns. Rebel barons celebrated. Prince Louis saw opportunity. Yet inside Newark Castle, John still clung to the faint hope that he could recover, rally his supporters, and crush his enemies one last time. In his fevered imagination, he still saw himself as the ruler who had once ordered prisoners hurled from catapults, who had hung men until the ravens feasted. But in reality, the king who had inspired terror now inspired only revulsion. As the storm gathered strength outside, John faced the cruel truth of mortality. He was not dying as a hero on the battlefield. He was not passing peacefully in bed surrounded by loyal kin. He was dying in filth and shame, abandoned by fortune, despised by history, remembered not for victories but for betrayals, cruelty, and now, humiliation. And yet, history would not end with his last breath. Even as his body failed, a new chapter waited to be written, not by him, but by the boy who would inherit his broken crown. A boy of only 9 years old, whose reign would last half a century. But that was still to come. For now, in the chamber at Newark, there was only the stench of death, the flicker of candlelight, and the sound of a king's body tearing itself apart. To understand how King John ended up writhing in agony on that filthy bed in Newark Castle, you must look back a single year earlier, to a meadow beside the River Thames at Runnymede. It was June 15, 1215, a day that would echo through centuries. John had spent his reign squeezing his kingdom like a lemon. Endless taxes, arbitrary justice, broken promises, and sheer cruelty had turned his barons, the very men whose swords upheld his crown, into bitter enemies. That summer, they rode against him, armored and furious, forcing the king to negotiate not from a throne but under threat of open rebellion. There, at Runnymede, the barons presented their demands in a parchment document unlike anything England had ever seen. It was called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its words struck at the very heart of royal authority. No longer could the king impose taxes without consent. No longer could he imprison free men without trial. Even the church would be guaranteed freedom from royal interference. John, cornered and outnumbered, had little choice. Chroniclers wrote that he smiled as he sealed the document, but behind the smile burned rage. To a man like John, raised on the idea of divine right, who believed his will was law, being forced to accept limits was humiliation beyond words. He signed it, yes. But in his mind, he was already plotting its destruction. The ink was scarcely dry before he acted. Within 10 weeks, Pope Innocent III declared Magna Carta null and void, calling it shameful and demeaning, an insult to royal dignity. John had outmaneuvered his barons, at least for the moment. But the damage was done. His enemies now knew he could be forced to yield. They would not forgive, and they would not forget. What followed was civil war, swift and brutal. England became a chessboard of castles, fields, and burned villages. The barons, desperate and divided, made a fateful decision. They invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, to cross the Channel and seize the English crown. To them, it was less betrayal than survival. If John could not be controlled, perhaps a foreign prince could be. In May of 1216, Louis landed with thousands of soldiers. London opened its gates to him. Half the kingdom hailed him as rightful king. John suddenly found himself surrounded, rebels on one side, French invaders on the other, and dwindling resources in his own treasury. But John was not the kind of man to go quietly. Where Louis showed mercy, John showed cruelty. At Worcester, he ordered every captured rebel hanged from the battlements until the ravens circled fat with human flesh. At Rochester, he catapulted prisoners over castle walls, reducing them to grotesque projectiles meant to break the will of defenders. He paid his mercenaries with silver stolen from monasteries, leaving behind trails of burned villages and violated women. Fear remained his favorite weapon, and for a time, it worked. Yet cruelty has limits. Gold does not. By the autumn of 1216, John's treasury was running dry. His mercenaries fought for coin, not loyalty, and the barons knew it. Without money, the king's army would dissolve like smoke. John understood this better than anyone. He needed one decisive victory, one dramatic gesture to swing momentum back in his favor. That hope brought him to East Anglia. In Norfolk and Suffolk, sheriffs had squeezed villages dry with taxes. Grain was piled high in storehouses, cattle driven off to feed the war, coin extracted with merciless efficiency. John believed these resources could become the backbone of his counterattack. If he could gather them, disrupt French supply lines, and reassert control, he might yet salvage his throne. On October 9, 1216, John rode into King's Lynn like a conqueror. Merchants and town leaders greeted him with forced smiles, pressing gold and silver into his hands. Chroniclers described a banquet that night in the bishop's hall, roasted meats, fresh bread, goblets of wine. John devoured it all like a starving man, 3 men's portions in one sitting. His courtiers watched nervously, but none dared tell their volatile king to slow down. Unbeknownst to them, the seeds of disaster were already planted. The town's water supply, contaminated by rains and the presence of thousands of soldiers, carried invisible killers, bacteria that no medieval physician could understand. Within days, they would turn the king's guts into a battlefield. But John's downfall was not just a matter of disease. It was also a matter of fate and pride. His plan to move north required splitting his forces. He would take a small escort along a safer route, while his baggage train, loaded with the crown jewels, sacred regalia, and decades of plunder, would attempt the direct but perilous crossing of the Wash. That decision, born of impatience and arrogance, would seal his doom. The Wash was no ordinary marsh. It was a shifting estuary where rivers met the sea, a maze of channels, quicksands, and tidal flows. Even local guides sometimes lost their way. When the tide came in, it moved faster than a galloping horse. The wagons set out on October 12, their wheels sinking deeper with each mile. Men shouted warnings. Horses reared in terror. And then, disaster struck. Whether through miscalculation or sheer misfortune, the baggage train became trapped as the waters rose. In minutes, centuries of treasure disappeared. Gold cups, jeweled swords, crowns passed from monarch to monarch, all swallowed by mud and tide. Not a single foot soldier escaped to tell the tale. John learned of it only when his baggage failed to arrive. Survivors staggered in hours later with the terrible news. Chroniclers wrote that grief struck him so violently he fell ill on the spot. Some blamed peaches and cider consumed at Swineshead Abbey. Others pointed to divine judgment for a lifetime of sins. But all agreed that the loss of his treasure was the moment the king broke. Without money, without symbols of kingship, John was no longer feared but pitied. The barons whispered that God himself had judged him. The French rejoiced. And John, consumed with fury and despair, began the final march that would end not in triumph, but in humiliation at Newark. On the morning of October 12, 1216, the king awoke in King's Lynn with renewed determination. For a fleeting moment, the feast of the night before, roasted meats, overflowing goblets of wine, and the forced smiles of wealthy merchants, had given him the illusion that fortune still favored him. He was the king of England, after all, and kings were not meant to fall. But the truth was far harsher. Outside the safety of the town, his kingdom was unraveling. Prince Louis of France commanded thousands of soldiers across the south, hailed as rightful ruler by many English barons. Rebellion burned like wildfire, and John's mercenaries, hungry for coin, whispered of desertion. If he could not secure his wealth, he could not secure his throne. Thus came the decision that would haunt him. To march north quickly, he would split his forces. With a small escort, John would ride the safer but longer road around the marshes. Meanwhile, his baggage train, dozens of wagons laden with the treasures of a kingdom, would attempt the perilous shortcut across the Wash. The baggage train was no ordinary caravan. It was the embodiment of Plantagenet power, the crown of Empress Matilda, golden goblets stolen from monasteries, jeweled swords blessed by bishops, ivory scepters, rings that glowed like fire in the light. More than wealth, these objects were symbols of legitimacy. They told the world that John was not just another warlord clawing for survival, he was king by divine right. But symbols, like men, can drown. Guided by locals who claimed to know the tides, the wagons rolled onto the marshes as the grey autumn morning stretched into noon. At first, the ground held firm enough. Wheels creaked over wet sand, hooves splashed shallow water. The men believed they could reach the other side before the sea returned. Then the landscape betrayed them. Channels widened. Mud sucked at the wheels. Horses balked and stumbled. Panic spread as the tide began to rise faster than expected, faster than any horse could outrun. Chroniclers later described it as if the earth itself had opened, swallowing men, beasts, and treasure whole. The cries of drivers urging their teams forward turned into screams for help. Picture it, soldiers abandoning wagons, only to sink waist-deep in quicksand. Horses rearing, eyes rolling white, before collapsing into the mire. Treasure chests bursting open, coins scattering across the mud like raindrops, before vanishing under dark water. A jeweled crown, once worn by generations of rulers, slipping from its velvet cushion and sinking without a trace. In a matter of minutes, centuries of plunder were gone. The Wash had claimed them all. No messenger escaped to warn the king. When John's escort reached the appointed meeting place that evening, they waited in growing dread. Hours passed. Then survivors straggled in, faces ashen, voices trembling, carrying only the news of catastrophe. The chronicler Roger of Wendover would later record that grief alone drove the king into illness. He described John falling into fever upon hearing the loss, seized by despair so sharp it twisted into physical agony. Others offered more colorful explanations, that he had gorged himself on peaches and cider at Swineshead Abbey, that divine judgment had struck him down. But whether it was grief, disease, or both, what followed was undeniable: the King of England began to die. At first, it was cramps, sharp but manageable. Perhaps indigestion, he thought. But by nightfall, the pain had intensified, rolling through him in waves. Fever followed, alternating with chills so fierce that no blanket could warm him. By dawn, he was too weak to stand. His bowels revolted, violent and unrelenting. The monks of Swineshead Abbey offered what comfort they could: clean straw, simple prayers, food he could not stomach. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or contamination. To them, illness was caused by bad air, excess humors, or divine punishment. They bled him, worsening his weakness. They gave him herbs that only inflamed his gut further. They burned incense to purify the air, but nothing could cleanse the rot inside him. Still, John refused to rest. He was a king at war, and kings did not lie idle while enemies closed in. Against the pleas of his advisers, he insisted on continuing north toward Newark, where he hoped to rally support for one last stand. The ride was torture. Each jolt of the horse sent knives of pain through his abdomen. He hunched in the saddle, clutching his stomach with one hand, gripping the reins with the other. Sweat poured from him, soaking his tunic, while his lips cracked with thirst he could not quench. Courtiers kept their distance, exchanging glances of horror as their king groaned aloud with every step of the journey. By the time he reached Newark Castle, John was scarcely conscious. Servants carried him inside, laying him in the finest chamber. But no luxury could disguise the truth, the king was dying. The sheets were soon stained with the evidence of his illness. The air grew foul despite herbs burned day and night. Attendants who once bowed low in reverence now turned their faces away in disgust. Here, the humiliation of his reign reached its climax. John, who had commanded absolute obedience, who had terrified enemies into submission, was reduced to helplessness. His intestines, once feasting on the richest banquets, now rebelled with bloody violence. His body, once feared as the vessel of royal power, became an object of pity. Yet even in these darkest hours, he could not escape the burden of memory. Between spasms, visions flickered through his fever, the signing of Magna Carta under duress, the cheers of Londoners greeting Prince Louis, the treasure sinking beneath the Washington. Each memory was another blade twisting inside him. Each reminder that he had failed not just as a ruler, but as a man. The chroniclers, writing for audiences who demanded moral lessons, portrayed his illness as divine punishment. And perhaps, in a way, it was. For the king who had starved children, betrayed allies, and murdered kin, no battlefield death would suffice. Instead, he was condemned to die like the peasants he had despised, of disease, filth, and misery. As October dragged on, the question was no longer whether John would recover, but how long he could endure. And while he writhed in agony, the kingdom he had ruled with terror and greed teetered on the edge of collapse. By the time King John reached Newark Castle in mid-October 1216, he was already more corpse than monarch. Carried from his horse by trembling servants, his face gaunt and drenched in sweat, his lips cracked, his eyes glazed with fever, the once fearsome ruler of England was barely conscious. The chamber prepared for him was the finest the castle could offer, a heavy oak bed with embroidered linens, walls hung with tapestries to keep out the autumn chill, candles flickering in silver holders. Yet none of these luxuries could disguise the reality. The sheets quickly became foul. The stench of his illness clung to every surface, no matter how much incense the attendants burned. No crown, no jeweled sword, no papal blessing could mask the humiliation of a body tearing itself apart. His physician, Master Peter, stood helplessly by. He had tried every known remedy of the age, bloodletting to release corrupt humors, herbal concoctions meant to settle the stomach, even talismans hung at the king's bedside. Nothing worked. The bloodletting left John weaker. The herbs triggered new waves of cramping. The talismans hung useless as John writhed, clutching his belly, his cries echoing through the stone chamber. The attendants, courtiers, guards, even priests, could barely contain their revulsion. They covered their faces with perfumed cloths, whispering that God had finally passed judgment on a tyrant. Some slipped away, claiming urgent duties elsewhere, rather than endure the sight and smell of their king reduced to such degradation. It was a cruel irony. John, who had starved his enemies, who had mocked their suffering, who had reveled in cruelty, now suffered a death that stripped away every shred of dignity. The very intestines that had once digested the finest banquets of Europe now rebelled against him, pouring forth rivers of bloody waste. His body, like his kingdom, was in open revolt. Between spasms, when the fever ebbed for a moment, he tried to act the part of king. Scribes bent close to record his words, though they gagged at the smell. Orders were dictated to commanders who lingered at the edge of the chamber, their faces stiff with unease. Yet his voice was faint, his words disjointed, and his promises rang hollow. Even those still loyal to him knew the truth: their king was dying, and his authority had collapsed with his strength. The news spread quickly. In London, Prince Louis received word of John's illness with barely concealed satisfaction. To him, victory was within reach. If John died, half the kingdom would fall into French hands without another battle. Rebel barons rejoiced. Chroniclers scribbled with relish, eager to portray the king's suffering as divine punishment for a life of sin. But not all of England awaited his death with joy. Some loyalists, calculating the risk of a French conquest, hurried to Newark. They did not come out of love for John, few could claim to love him, but out of fear for their own futures. A French king would remember every act of defiance, and those who had prospered under John might lose everything. Among the visitors was Nicola de la Haye, the remarkable woman who had defended Lincoln Castle against overwhelming odds. Even in his fevered state, John recognized her worth. In one of his last acts, he appointed her Sheriff of Lincolnshire, the only woman in England to hold such authority. It was a gesture born of desperation, perhaps, but also a rare acknowledgement of merit over gender in a time when survival mattered more than custom. The abbot of Croxton was summoned to offer spiritual comfort. The confession of sins from one of the most reviled rulers in English history must have been extraordinary. Whispers claimed John admitted to the murder of his nephew Arthur, to the starvation of hostages, to the countless rapes and betrayals that had defined his reign. But whether his words were true confession or the rambling of a fever-broken mind, none could say. Chroniclers, eager for a moral lesson, recorded repentance. In reality, the dying king may have been bargaining with a god he had spent his life defying. As the days dragged on, the torment only worsened. Food was impossible. Even water triggered violent spasms. His bowels expelled not only waste but blood, until every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a reminder of how little time remained. Servants changed his bedding again and again, but the smell of death could not be hidden. During the long nights, delirium claimed him. He raved of his coronation at Westminster, of Arthur's screams when he struck him down, of the treasure slipping beneath the waves of the Washington. He saw himself as a boy again, John Lackland, the unwanted youngest son, desperate for approval from a father who never gave it. Perhaps it was this early humiliation that had driven him to such extremes of cruelty, always trying to prove himself by crushing others. Now, at the end, he was forced to face the emptiness of it all. On October 17, a storm gathered outside Newark Castle. Thunder rolled across the sky, rain hammered the stone walls, lightning split the night. Inside, the king fought his final battle, not against barons or French soldiers, but against the rebellion of his own body. Each spasm was another act of defiance from flesh against will. Chroniclers struggled to describe the spectacle without offending delicate sensibilities. Some claimed he was struck down by gluttony, others by poison from monks at Swineshead Abbey. But the truth was simpler and more brutal: John was dying of dysentery, a disease that claimed thousands every year. It was not glorious. It was not noble. It was filthy, painful, and humiliating. By then, even his most loyal courtiers knew the end was near. They whispered prayers as the papal legate Guala Bikiri prepared the rites for the dying. Yet even in this moment, John's stubbornness clung on. He dictated his last will and testament, leaving his legacy in the hands of the church rather than the barons who had forced Magna Carta upon him. He ordered that he be buried at Worcester Cathedral, commending his body and soul to God and to St. Wulfstan. It was a final act of defiance, a king who had spent his life resisting limits, still trying to shape how he would be remembered. But history would not obey him. His reign had been one of cruelty and failure. His death, undignified and foul, would become his legacy. The storm outside reached its height on October 18, rain lashed the windows, thunder shook the castle, lightning lit the chamber where England's most hated king lay gasping. His courtiers recited prayers for the dying, their voices trembling. His body convulsed one last time, bowels still rebelling, and then grew still. King John was dead. Not on a battlefield, not in triumph, not even in peace, but in filth and shame, a tyrant undone by his own flesh. When the storm finally broke over Newark Castle, the body of King John lay still. Servants moved quickly, as they always did in death, for even the corpse of a hated monarch demanded ritual and respect. They washed him as best they could, though the task was grim. Days of sickness had left him covered in sweat and waste. The finest robes were draped over limbs that had convulsed in filth only hours before. A crown was placed upon his head, tilted awkwardly on hair matted with fever. In death, they tried to restore what disease had stripped away: majesty, dignity, the image of kingship. Yet to those who had witnessed his last hours, the sight rang hollow. The robes and jewels were stage props, masking the humiliation of a man who had died not as a warrior but as a victim of his own body. The journey to his burial place began soon after. His coffin, carried by loyal retainers, left Newark and traveled through a kingdom fractured by war. French soldiers occupied swaths of land to the south. Rebel barons still defied the crown. Villages burned, fields lay barren, churches had been looted. And now, through this wasteland, the funeral procession of a king crept slowly, watched by eyes that carried little grief. Peasants along the road paused their work to stare. Some crossed themselves, fearing the omen of a dead king. Others spat, muttering curses under their breath. For them, John had been the embodiment of oppression, a ruler who had taxed them into starvation, who had burned their homes, who had demanded their sons for his wars. Now he passed powerless, unable to command even respect from those who lined the muddy roads. The nobles who accompanied the coffin did so not from love, but from calculation. To abandon their dead king would be to betray their own fortunes. A French ruler might strip them of their lands. A new English king might reward loyalty. They marched not in mourning, but in anticipation of what came next. The chosen destination was Worcester Cathedral. Originally, John had wished to be buried at Beaulieu Abbey, a monastery he had founded as penance for his father's sins. But Beaulieu lay deep in rebel territory, unsafe for a royal burial. Worcester, however, was still secure, and its cathedral housed the tomb of St. Wulfstan, an Anglo-Saxon bishop revered for holiness. Perhaps John, in his final confession, had hoped that proximity to a saint would redeem his soul. The procession wound its way south, banners drooping in the rain, armored knights trudging in silence. Chroniclers did not record grand crowds or public grief. Unlike the funerals of other kings, there was no pilgrimage of mourners, no outpouring of sorrow. Instead, there was indifference, and in some corners, relief. England had rid itself of bad King John. When the coffin reached Worcester, the cathedral opened its doors with solemn ceremony. Priests chanted prayers, incense filled the air, and the rituals of kingship unfolded as they always had. A monarch, whatever his sins, was still anointed, still God's chosen. They lowered his coffin into the ground before the tomb of St. Wulfstan, sealing him in stone and memory. The inscription carved upon his tomb would later claim that, in dying he brought much peace to the world. It was an attempt to soften the truth, to suggest that even a cruel reign could yield a blessing through its end. Yet few believed it. His reputation was already secure as one of the most hated kings in English history. But history does not end at a grave. Even as his body settled into the cold earth, the question of England's future loomed large. Prince Louis still claimed the throne. Rebel barons still plotted. And yet, amid this chaos, John had left behind one fragile thread of hope, a boy of 9 years old, his son Henry. At Corfe Castle in Dorset, young Henry was being carefully guarded. He had known little of his father's cruelty, but he had inherited the crown all the same. In the days after John's death, William Marshal, England's greatest knight and a man of unmatched loyalty, moved swiftly. He gathered the boy's supporters, rallied wavering nobles, and arranged a coronation at Gloucester Abbey. The scene could not have been more different from the filth of Newark. Henry, small and solemn in robes far too large for him, accepted the crown placed upon his head. Around him stood men who had once cursed his father, but who now saw in him a chance to preserve English independence. Better a child king than a French conqueror. Marshal himself acted as regent, wielding authority with the wisdom and restraint John had never possessed. Under his guidance, the war began to turn. Barons who had supported Louis reconsidered. Loyalty shifted. The invasion faltered. Within a year, Louis was forced to retreat, his ambitions of ruling England dissolved. And so, out of the grotesque death of John, a new order emerged. Magna Carta, once despised and annulled by John, was reissued in Henry's name, not as a humiliation, but as a foundation. Over time, it would become the bedrock of English constitutional monarchy, a legacy far greater than John had ever imagined. The irony was complete. The man who had tried to crush liberty with cruelty had ensured its survival through failure. The king who had died in filth and shame had, by accident, fathered the principles that would outlive him for centuries. As the years passed, Worcester Cathedral remained John's resting place. Visitors came, not to venerate him, but to marvel at the story of his downfall. Unlike other royal tombs, his did not become a site of pilgrimage. No miracles were claimed. No prayers were offered in his name. He was remembered not for glory, but for disgrace. Centuries later, when his tomb was opened in 1797, his skeleton revealed an unremarkable man, 5 feet 6 inches tall, ordinary in stature, extraordinary only in infamy. Time had reduced him to bones, just as it would any man. But his story lived on, told and retold, not as an example of greatness, but as a warning of how power, wielded with cruelty, can end in humiliation. Thus the funeral of King John marked not just the end of a tyrant, but the beginning of something larger. Out of his failure rose a boy who would reign for half a century, and a charter that would echo through history. The hated king was gone, but in death he had unwittingly secured the very thing he feared most, a kingdom bound by law, not by the whims of a tyrant. The death of King John could have been the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. A hated monarch, a kingdom in flames, and a foreign prince already hailed as rightful king in London, these were the ingredients of collapse. Yet fate, and the shrewdness of a few men, turned disaster into survival. John's 9-year-old son, Henry, had been kept safe at Newark Castle in Dorset. While his father writhed in filth at Newark, the boy played in quiet courtyards, guarded closely by loyal retainers. He was small, solemn, and utterly unprepared to inherit a throne. But he was also innocent, untouched by the cruelty that had defined his father's reign. And in that innocence lay opportunity. William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, recognized it at once. At 70, Marshal was the greatest knight of his age, a man who had fought in tournaments, crusades, and countless battles. He had served kings faithfully for decades, even when those kings had betrayed him. To him fell the task of preserving the dynasty from ruin. Within days of John's death, Marshal gathered loyal barons and bishops at Gloucester. On October 28, 1216, in the Abbey Church, the boy Henry was crowned King of England. The coronation was modest compared to the grandeur of Westminster, but its symbolism was immense. Better, the barons reasoned, to rally around a child of their own line than submit to the foreign yoke of Prince Louis. Marshal himself acted as regent, wielding power with the wisdom John had never possessed. Where John inspired fear, Marshal inspired respect. Where John taxed and punished without restraint, Marshal sought compromise. His age and reputation gave him authority even the most hardened barons dared not question. The first act of the regency was bold and symbolic, the reissue of Magna Carta. John had annulled it, despised it, and fought against it with blood and fire. Now, in the name of his son, it was presented not as humiliation but as promise. Stripped of a few controversial clauses, it became a charter of stability, an assurance to the barons that their rights would be honored. This moment transformed Magna Carta from a failed peace treaty into the foundation of English constitutional tradition. In Henry's small, trembling hands, the document that John had despised became the key to saving the crown. It was political genius. A child could not be blamed for his father's sins, and a child's reign could be shaped by wiser men. Meanwhile, the war against Louis continued. At first, the French prince seemed poised for victory. His forces occupied London and much of the southeast. His banner flew from castles that had once sworn loyalty to John. But Marshal and the Loyalists played a longer game. They courted wavering barons, promising safety, land, and reconciliation. Slowly, the tide turned. In 1217, Marshal led the royal army to a decisive victory at the Battle of Lincoln. Though aged and frail, he mounted his horse and fought like the knight he had always been. Chroniclers marveled at his courage, leading charges that broke the French lines. That triumph, combined with a naval victory off Sandwich that cut Louis's supply lines, forced the French to sue for peace. By September 1217, the Treaty of Lambeth ended the invasion. Louis renounced his claim to the English throne and returned to France. England, though battered and divided, remained under Plantagenet rule. A dynasty that seemed doomed at Newark had been saved. For Henry III, the reign would be long, 56 years in total. He would grow from a frightened boy into a complex monarch, patron of cathedrals and politics alike. His rule had its own crises, rebellions, and failures. But it endured. And that endurance was built upon the ashes of his father's disgrace. The irony could not be sharper. John had spent his life resisting limits, hoarding wealth, betraying allies, and crushing opposition. He had tried to erase Magna Carta, destroy its meaning, and reassert absolute authority. In death, he ensured the opposite. His cruelty had made the charter necessary, his failure had made it permanent. What began as a desperate document forced upon a tyrant became a cornerstone of liberty, law, and governance. Centuries later, Magna Carta would echo far beyond England. It would inspire struggles for rights across Europe, influence the English Civil War, shape the American colonies, and become a touchstone for the idea that even kings are not above the law. This, too, was part of John's legacy, though not by choice. He had wanted absolute power. History gave him the role of midwife to constitutionalism. Meanwhile, his personal memory fared far worse. Other kings were remembered for victories or great works. John was remembered for cruelty, humiliation, and a death too grotesque to be forgotten. Chroniclers delighted in the details of his dysentery, portraying it as divine justice. The people, for once, agreed with their rulers. John had been a tyrant, and his end was fitting. Yet his death mattered. It cleared the stage for others, Marshal, Henry, and the barons, to build something lasting. Out of the mud of the Wash, out of the filth of Newark, came a kingdom reborn. The irony is that John never intended it. He died believing himself a failure, stripped of treasure, dignity, and loyalty. And perhaps he was. But history often takes failure and reshapes it. In the case of John, his collapse became the seed of something greater than his life could ever achieve. When visitors today step into Worcester Cathedral and look upon his tomb, they do not see a saint or a hero. They see the warning carved in stone, that power without restraint leads not to glory but to ruin, that tyranny collapses under its own weight, and that even kings must bow before the limits of flesh, fortune, and law. And that, perhaps, is John's true legacy, not the gold he lost, not the cruelty he practiced, but the reminder that from the downfall of the worst can rise the hope of the future. Centuries pass, and kings are remembered for many things: conquests, cathedrals, laws, or legacies. Richard the Lionheart, John's elder brother, was remembered for crusades and knightly valor. Henry II, their father, was remembered for reforms of justice. Edward I for conquest, Edward III for glory at Cressy, Henry V for Agincourt. But John was remembered for none of these. He was remembered for losing. For cruelty. for humiliation. And most of all, for the manner of his death. The chronicles never tired of retelling it. They lingered over the grotesque details of Newark, the sweating, the convulsions, the rivers of blood and waste. They cast it as divine punishment, a moral lesson writ in flesh. To medieval readers, it was a warning from God, tyrants meet foul ends. To later generations, it became darkly comic. Schoolchildren, centuries later, learned to call him Bad King John, not only because of Magna Carta but because he had died of dysentery. History had stripped him of grandeur and left him only with ridicule. And yet, even ridicule can echo. For beneath the mockery lay a deeper truth: John had embodied the dangers of absolute power. He had taxed without mercy, judged without fairness, killed without hesitation. He had treated England as his purse and his plaything. In doing so, he had driven his barons to rebellion, his people to despair, and his kingdom to the brink of conquest. He had lost Normandy to the French, lost treasure to the Wash, and nearly lost England itself. In the end, his death did not simply mark the end of a man, but the collapse of an idea, that kings could rule unchecked, bound only by their will. The irony is that John's greatest legacy was one he hated, Magna Carta. He had signed it under duress, annulled it with fury, and fought against it with fire and blood. But after his death, it was reissued in the name of his young son, and then again, and again. Each reissue gave it new life, until it ceased to be a mere peace treaty and became a symbol. Over centuries, it inspired rebels and reformers, lawyers and legislators, from Simon de Montfort to the American founders. The idea that even kings must bow to law can be traced back to that meadow at Runnymede, and to the tyrant who resisted it. Meanwhile, John's lost treasure remained lost. The Wash, with its shifting sands and treacherous tides, swallowed it whole. For generations, rumors persisted of fishermen pulling up jeweled goblets in their nets, or peasants finding golden coins in the mud. Expeditions scoured the marshes, convinced they would uncover crowns and scepters lying just beneath the surface. But the sea gave nothing back. The symbols of John's power lay buried in the earth, claimed by tides he could not control. Perhaps it was fitting, the wealth he had wrung from his kingdom, the jewels that had adorned his cruelty, hidden forever in a grave of mud and salt water. His tomb at Worcester Cathedral fared little better. Unlike the shrines of saintly kings, it did not become a place of pilgrimage. No candles were lit in devotion. No prayers were whispered for intercession. Visitors might pause, glance at the stone effigy, and move on. When the tomb was opened in 1797, what they found was ordinary, a skeleton, 5 feet 6.5 inches tall, nothing remarkable. The flesh that had terrified nobles and peasants alike was gone, leaving only bones, as fragile as any man's. This was John's final humiliation, that even his memory inspired no reverence. He was not hated enough to become a martyr, nor admired enough to become a hero. He was simply despised, a name synonymous with tyranny and failure. His effigy in Worcester bore the words of a poet who tried to soften the truth: "In this tomb lies the image of a king who in dying brought much peace to the world." A delicate way of saying what everyone already knew, that England was better without him. And yet, history is rarely so simple. For while John left behind disgrace, he also left behind transformation. His cruelty forced the barons to act. His weakness allowed Magna Carta to endure. His death cleared the way for a child king guided by men wiser than himself. Out of his tyranny came the seed of constitutional monarchy. Out of his failure came England's survival. That is the paradox of John. He was the worst of kings, yet without him, the path to the future might have been different. By losing, he gave others reason to build. By dying in humiliation, he ensured that England would never again accept unchecked power so easily. His reign was ruinous, but his death reshaped a nation. Today, when historians speak of John, they do so with a mix of contempt and fascination. They recount his betrayals, his cruelty, his losses, his grotesque death. But they also acknowledge that without John's failures, the story of England would not be the same. The Magna Carta would not be legend. The Plantagenets might have fallen to the French. The long march toward constitutional rule might never have begun. In that sense, John's legacy is not one of greatness, but of warning. A reminder carved in stone and written in chronicles, that power abused destroys itself, that tyranny carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, and that even kings are subject to laws greater than themselves. The thunderstorm that raged over Newark on the night of his death eventually passed, leaving behind a kingdom forever altered. His son Henry would reign for half a century, building where his father had destroyed. The Magna Carta would live, growing stronger with every reissue. And John himself would rest in Worcester, a king remembered not for glory but for disgrace, his life a lesson, his death a caution. Thus ends the story of King John of England, who lost an empire, betrayed his people, despised the law, died in filth, and yet, by sheer failure, gave birth to liberty. A king who left no triumphs, no monuments, no victories, but who left, instead, a warning that echoes louder than any crown, that even the mightiest can fall, and that no power, however absolute, can silence the rebellion of history itself.